boss, Professor Sarangi, and Professor Swapna Prabhu, very distinguished faculty members of the university, dear students, and many of my friends who are sitting here. I must at the outset express my gratefulness to the University Vice Chancellor for organizing this event and giving me an opportunity to come here and share some thoughts. And I must express my thanks to Professor Subhash Das, with whom I was coordinating, and of course Professor Swapna Prabhu. We had long, many occasions we spoke over telephone, regarding this seminar and so forth. So straight away coming to the topic, this idea of Swaraj and contemporary challenges is of critical significance for not only India but for the whole world. Because independence of India, or the quest for Swaraj, was a quest for decolonization. So therefore, demand for Swaraj for India was a demand to make the world free from many forms of exploitation, both internal and external. So therefore this topic is of enduring significance in the context of our nation, in the context of the whole world. So, the word Swaraj is primarily, its literal meaning is Swaraj means self-rule. Mahatma Gandhi said it's a Vedic word. It has a spiritual significance. As Madam Vice Chancellor said, there is a moral autonomy which is integral to the idea of Swaraj. Or as Professor Sarangi said, there is some kind of a solidarity which is inherent to the idea of Swaraj. Okay, but having said that, if you look at the history of India, the modern Indian history, we find that the idea of Swaraj was invoked by several people. But for the first time, it was Dadabhai Naoroji, the first economist of India, the grand old man, who understood that poverty in India was a byproduct of colonial rule, colonial policies and colonial exploitation. He gave a drain theory that because of British rule, Indian wealth was being drained out and it was reaching the British soil. And to develop that drain theory, he actually collected a lot of data, rigorously researched the British policies and gave the idea that colonial policies, or the policies adopted by colonial authorities, resulted in deepening of poverty, worsening of famine, and accelerating the drain of the wealth of India. So therefore, he found the remedy in Swaraj to address those problems. But to develop the idea of Swaraj, he actually was impacted deeply by two factors. One, international factor, another domestic factor. This is our national issue. First international factor was American Civil War of 1861-64. On the issue of slavery, there was disagreement within the northern part of US and southern part of that country. So therefore, civil war took place, and that civil war initially boomed the cotton trade in Bombay. Dadabhai Naoroji was involved in cotton trade, so he got some profit. But as the civil war continued and ended, it caused complete ruination of the cotton trade. So Dadabhai Naoroji understood that Indian economy was integrated with the capitalist economies in the world due to the British policies. So there were factors which actually caused destruction of the Indian economy, and India had absolutely no control over those factors. So while the Civil War in America was won during 1861 to 64. Just 2 years later, a devastating famine caused deaths to 1 million people in Odisha. That was the famine of 1866, now the Durഭിksha. And both the factors, American Civil War and Odisha famine of 1866, completely shattered Dadabhai Naoroji. I never knew that Dadabhai Naoroji was so badly and adversely affected in terms of his, moral and mental health. So he wrote his book Poverty and British Rule in India in 1901. It was published from London. That was the first ever book in India written by an Indian, and it deeply went into the causes behind the phenomenon of poverty. So he, in that book, only 3 days back I found 5 references to Odisha. And out of those 5 references, 3 references to Odisha famine of 1866. So in other words, to understand the incidents of poverty caused by the British rule, the sufferings of Odia people, their deaths, it actually impacted the mind of Dadabhai Naoroji, which is not known frankly. So in 1906, December 1906, when he was presiding over the Indian National Congress session in Calcutta, he boldly declared that the objective of the Congress was to establish Swaraj in India, or Indian self-government. So the idea of Swaraj, which was developed in the early 20th century by Dadabhai Naoroji, that can be traced to Odisha famine and the American Civil War. So this Odisha dimension, which is there behind the idea of Swaraj, is quite illuminating and quite revealing. And as an Odia, we must all know this, that the Odisha famine of 1866, which caused massive suffering and huge loss of lives, 1/3 of the people of Odisha, they died. And that death, never went in vain. It influenced Dadabhai Naoroji to develop the idea of Swaraj, which is quite revealing. And he was the first leader who said, and if I have a book here, it is written by Dainar Patel. It is the latest biography of Dadabhai Naoroji. It is published by Harvard Business School. And here in page 50 to 51, I had good eyesight for quite some time, but because of this WhatsApp, I'm writing articles in WhatsApp. I think my eyesight is getting affected. He said the Odisha famine was for Naoroji. The Odisha famine for Naoroji, a stark example of India's perilous economic and political position. So this, it's quite illuminating and revealing to know that the sufferings of Odisha contributed, to the development of idea of Swaraj. But having said this, if you look at that, it's actually important to revisit Dadabhai Naoroji. I would strongly recommend, Utkal University to get the book Poverty and British Rule, which was published in 1901 in London. And recently only I read that book. Because, even Lord Salisbury, who was the Prime Minister of UK, he said if the poverty report of Odisha famine would be, the Odisha famine report, would be placed in British Parliament, that would expose the exploitation caused by the British rulers. Having said this, this is the actually development of the idea of Swaraj in the beginning of 20th century. And it was Dadabhai Naroji who preceded Lokmanya Tilak. To Lokmanya Tilak who said, Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. Lokmanya Tilak's that revolutionary statement electrified the whole country. When Jawaharlal Nehru was a young student in London, he described himself as a Tirakite. Okay, so Mahatma Gandhi, in his first volume of the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, in sometime, I have, in this, my keynote address, which has been printed in the department, which will be circulated. I can tell you the second page itself, and I refer to the third page maybe. Gandhi's 5th July 1894, he wrote a letter to Dadabhai Naroji. And in that letter, he says, in the footnote, that he was the first man who invoked the idea of Swaraj to address the poverty of India. So, idea of Swaraj was developed in the context of the sufferings of Oriya people, and it was developed to apply, to interrogate the British rule, to examine the causes behind the poverty, and to find a remedy for the poverty of India. So, if idea of Swaraj in 20th century was developed by Dadabhai Naroji to address the problems of poverty, so today in 2022, India is going through a phase in the post-pandemic period where our economy has been flattened. People are slipping into poverty. More and more people are slipping into poverty. Massive levels of unemployment. Even in the US, 14% of the people are below poverty line. If you take into account the definition of poverty of the US, England or Mother any country in Europe, except probably Scandinavian countries. Because I have seen in all of us who have visited the Western world, be it America, be it UK or any country, or other countries, Germany or France, we have seen people begging on the streets. Somebody in Washington, when I was there in 2003 to deliver a lecture in George Washington University, one gentleman, he was holding a placard. He was not begging, he said, no family, no money, no home, please help. So that is the state of affairs in America. So just imagine, America is independent for more than 200 years. And you are just independent for 75 years. In our poverty rate has certainly declined, but still we have maybe 30%. In RUSA it is 29%. Okay, so therefore, if the idea of poverty was developed in the context of poverty, famine, drain of wealth of India, so that idea is acutely or deeply relevant in present-day context when, because of pandemic, people are slipping into poverty. Our GDP rates are quite low. In fact, the 13% GDP rate which the government of India recently released, that is only taking into account the formal sector, not the informal sector. In fact, our GDP rate, according to top economists, is negative. Okay, so therefore, to address the issues of poverty, which is getting multiplied, so the idea of Swaraj is relevant. And in the present day world, what is happening is that apart from poverty, there are higher levels of inequality. So inequality is an issue which is plaguing the minds of top academics of the world. See, Thomas Piketty wrote that book, Capital in 21st Century, and the central theme of the book was high levels of income inequality. And that has been accentuated by neoliberal policies across the world. So therefore, when poverty combines with inequality, is literally making life miserable and causing massive problems. And we have today a war going on in Ukraine. As much as war was going on, that was a civil war, here is also a kind of a war which is affecting the whole world. So in that context, the idea of Swaraj in terms of self-rule, it is critically significant. And therefore, Dadabhai Naroji's understanding and insights, which define the idea of Swaraj, is very relevant. And when Dadabhai Naroji wrote that book, the poverty and British rule in 1901, Mahatma Gandhi in 1926, in Young India, he wrote an article, I have given the reference here. He said, that time when people used to criticize the British rule, they used to face sedition charges, 124A of the Indian Penal Code. Gandhi wrote that anybody who criticized the British government was slapped with sedition. It was Dadabhai Naoroji who was not touched, in spite of his trenchant criticism of the British economic policies. That fearlessness of Dadabhai Naoroji, Gandhiji said, was required to acquire Swaraj. Okay, then today, for instance, if that idea of Swaraj developed by Dadabhai Naoroji actually influenced others, and Gandhi said that for the first time you understood that British colonial policies were primarily instrumental in causing massive poverty in India. He said, I understood the problems of poverty of India and the fact that more than half of the Indian population were living on one meal a day during 1920s. He said he owed that idea to Dadabhai Naoroji, who invoked the idea of Swaraj for the first time in 1906 as the President of the Indian National Congress. Now, if Gandhi in 1926 was saying that anybody who criticized the government was facing sedition charges, so what is happening in India in 2020? Now, sedition charges are being slapped against people who just write a line in the newspaper that the chief minister in Gujarat will be changed. The journalist wrote it and he was charged with sedition. My friend Umar Khalid from jail, he is still inside jail. He is also facing sedition. Many of us who are boldly writing, we have been warned. Okay, so therefore, there is a beautiful web portal called article14.com. Article14.com made a study of sedition charges slapped against people who are dissenting with the policies of the government. It said in a very careful study they made, article14.com, that after 2014, sedition charges went up by 28% as compared to the previous periods. See, sedition charge has been used by successive governments, not just Modi government. Even Indira Gandhi government did it. Rajiv Gandhi government invoked sedition charges against those who criticize the government. Even Odisha government has done it. So, regardless of the party in power, sedition charge has been invoked or slapped. But the point is, after 2014, according to article14.com, sedition charges are being increasingly used primarily to suppress dissent. Suppress all those who are raising their voice against the political regimes, regardless of party in power. So therefore, if idea of Swaraj was invoked by, Gandhi said 1926, and I have written in this, my lecture speech, that repeal of the sedition law means establishment of Swaraj. And this is a great sentence of Gandhi, who himself was charged with sedition in 1922. He was convicted, he was sentenced to imprisonment. And he said in 26 that repeal of sedition law means the establishment of Swaraj. So if repeal of sedition is equal to the establishment of Swaraj, so persistence of sedition law in Indian Penal Code is a challenge to the idea of Swaraj. So therefore, the Chief Justice of India, Justice N.V. Ramana, while actually adjudicating the matter concerning PIL, he said, he put a question. Chief Justice Ramana, who recently retired, he said, why this colonial law is still there in our penal code? So therefore, voices raised agitation's launched against sedition law means, that actually constitutes a measure to remove one challenge to the idea of Swaraj. Having said this, the sedition law is certainly a big challenge because it was used by the legislature, it has been used by successive political agents in India, and again also let me just come down to another aspect of this challenge, and this is called, the other point is that increasingly people are coming to the streets to agitate. Farmers came to the streets. They agitated for one long year against the farm laws which were repealed. Okay, eventually by Prime Minister Modi he declared that they would repeal. The question is now even agitation or political movements, they are being ridiculed by the political leaders. So when the farmers were agitating, Prime Minister Modi in the parliament itself, he said they are Andolonjibis. So this is kind of a challenge to the fundamental right to agitate, fundamental right to assemble, fundamental right to protest. So, Mahatma Gandhi, 1925, he gave a beautiful definition of Swaraj. He says Swaraj doesn't mean acquisition of power by a few. Swaraj would mean acquisition of power by masses to control the people who exercise the power and to control them or question them when they abuse the authority. In other words, to question, to dissent, to interrogate, and to protest. That is the idea of Swaraj. So therefore, anybody who questions the right of people to agitate or ridicules them by saying that they are Andolonjibis or they do not have that, let's say they cannot do that. That means those very authorities of people who in power, they are going against the very idea of Swaraj. See, Ambedkar in 1941 gave a great slogan, educate, agitate and organize. Educate, organize and agitate. Something like that. Educate, agitate or organize. So Gandhi and Ambedkar's, and Gandhi's definition of Swaraj in terms of acquisition by masses of the power to regulate authority and question authority. If you juxtapose it with Ambedkar's slogan, educate, agitate, organize, they constitute the core meaning of Swaraj. So therefore, even a Supreme Court judge, when he was adjudicating a matter concerning the farmers' movement, he said, how can the farmers start a movement against a matter which is sub judice? The judgment, the observations of the Honorable Judge of the Supreme Court was going against the very legislative intent of the Constituent Assembly, which made it very clear that even if a matter is sub judice, there is a fundamental right to agitate, to protest, to assemble. The fundamental right cannot be subordinated to a matter which is being adjudicated by the Supreme Court. Fundamental right is a position regardless of the matter which is pending in the Supreme Court, regardless of the state of that matter, whether it is adjudicated or pending or whatever it is. So therefore, this is a statement coming from a Supreme Court judge is completely negation of the idea of Swaraj, which was outlined by Gandhi and very beautifully captured in the slogan of Ambedkar. Having said this, when one questions the people's fundamental right to protest, one questions democracy, one questions the idea of Swaraj. When people were protesting in Kheda in 1917, not to pay land revenue to the British authorities, it was being led by Sardar Patel, even before Gordoli Satyagraha. So Mahatma Gandhi, in 1917, he delivered a speech. He said, right to protest and to become conscious of the right which are inherent to democracy is nothing but the idea of Swaraj. He articulated that in 1917. So right to protest and to become conscious of the rights inherent to democracy is nothing but idea of Swaraj. And today, India has been described as a partially free country, an electoral autocracy. by certain, international agencies, which earlier described India as a free country, India as a democratic country. Now the same international agencies which are evaluating the state of democracy across the world, they have described India as an electoral autocracy and partially free country. And the freedom of press index, we are down below 150 from 143. So therefore, all these are challenges to the idea of Swaraj. When you are, your democracy itself is negated or is being compromised, and India will be described as an electoral autocracy for various reasons. This means that is a huge challenge to the idea of Swaraj. Because Swaraj, as Gandhi defined on one occasion, an Englishman asked him, what do you mean by Swaraj? He said there are wider notions of Swaraj, but one simple and limited notion is that people should establish their government by exercising their right to vote, and those voters should be registered. Okay, so if that is the idea of Swaraj which Gandhi gave, today we have an elected government. People are registering themselves as voters, they are casting their votes, but then the core meaning of Swaraj, which is democracy, that is under challenge. So therefore, we are facing a challenge when democracy is facing a challenge in India. We faced a huge challenge in 1975 when emergency was imposed. We are facing a challenge again when the powers that we are ridiculing, the right to protest, right to association, and now they are talking about duties without talking about the corresponding rights. So these are challenges to the idea of Swaraj. So having said this, the other challenge to the idea of Swaraj is the challenge to the freedom of the press. Freedom of the press is one huge component of the idea of Swaraj. See, during Second World War, when press censorship was imposed, Gandhi wrote about non-violence. British authorities told him, when we are engaged in war activities, there is no place for non-violence. So Gandhi started his only satyagraha for the cause of press freedom. There was the individual satyagraha of 1941. So before he started the satyagraha, he said freedom of speech and freedom of pen is the foundation of Swaraj. If one stone of that foundation is disturbed, all our might should be employed to defend it. So just imagine, if idea of Swaraj, he outlined in terms of freedom of the press, and he said that is the foundation of Swaraj. Today, if you are declining, we are actually, our position is declining the list of countries in the freedom of press index. This means, these internal challenges to the idea of Swaraj is posing a grave danger to the freedom of the press and of course the freedom of Swaraj. The other, having said that, the many aspects of freedom struggle were looked at from the perspective of women. It was a great freedom struggle in history of humanity. No other freedom struggle actually looked at or employed the gender perspective as much as the leadership of Indian freedom struggle did. So when America got independence, the American Declaration of Independence first line, all men are created equal. Wife of John Adams was the key person, key member of the American Constitutional Assembly. He questioned, he said, men have always been acting as tyrants towards women. Remember the ladies. American great leader that John Adams' wife wrote a letter. John Adams said that our revolution brought about the indiscipline amongst slaves, restlessness amongst students, and now a more numerous tribe called women, they are demanding equal rights. Unlike French Revolution or American struggle for independence, Indian struggle for independence had a gender perspective. So Gandhi said, in 1921, what is Swaraj? He said Swaraj would mean Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and all other religious groupings coexisting, and that would create a condition when at the dead of the night a young girl can walk around safely in the midnight. In 29 again he says Swaraj would mean respecting the women to the greatest extent possible. Now, so this is the idea of Swaraj, respecting women. and the safety and security of women, even in the dead of the night. That was defined by Gandhi. And this year, on August 15, our Prime Minister waxed eloquent on Nari Shakti from Red Fort. In same day, rapists and murderers connected with Bilkis Banu were released. It was aghast to see a Prime Minister talking about women's safety and security. In same day, the convicted criminals released by applying the law of remission. So therefore, why isn't it a challenge to the idea of Swaraj? Earlier the challenge to the idea of Swaraj was coming from British authorities. And now the challenge to the idea of Swaraj is coming from our own internal sources. Now these are the issues on which people are writing. Even BJP spokesperson wrote an article in Indian Express on that issue, and she was trolled heavily. So these are the aspects which we need to be kept in mind. The other aspect, which I like to flag is the point that, this issue of, air pollution. Swapna ji told that I wrote an article on air pollution, Gandhi and air pollution. Actually, Mahatma Gandhi on 1st January 1918, while addressing the Mohammadabad municipality workers, he said, "What is Swaraj?" That time he gave a completely new dimension to Swaraj. On 1st January, he said, Swaraj would mean people's access to clean air, clean water, and adequate grain. Adequate food, in other words. So today, I'm sure the air quality index of Bhubaneswar is much better than air quality index of Delhi. Air quality of index in Delhi is always poor, severe, hazardous. It's never normal. So if quality air remains integral to the idea of Swaraj, if Delhi doesn't have quality air, this means Delhi doesn't have Swaraj. If Bhubaneswar has better quality, this means Bhubaneswar has Swaraj. If you go to the villages, there is no air pollution. This means those villages are enjoying Swaraj, and Delhi doesn't enjoy Swaraj. In Prime Minister's office, in my friends' houses, wherever I go, I find air purifiers. So this means they want to have Swaraj through MSc. Okay, a Prime Minister's office wants to enjoy Swaraj, and the rest of the society cannot afford to have an air purifier, which costs around 30,000, 40,000 rupees. So Gandhi, Gandhi's look at the insights of Gandhi, that Swaraj would mean people's access to clean air, clean water, and adequate grain. That means food security, and your rights to breathe clean air, which is now considered by, Supreme Court is expanded the fundamental rights to have a healthy environment. In 1913, Gandhi was writing several articles on health. He wrote a first article on air, then water, then food. 1913, and he wrote that in modern civilization, air will be polluted. People living in cities will run away to foreign places to breathe clean air. That would involve a cost. In other words, in modern civilization, would put a cost on air. This is what exactly has happened. In 2018 or 19, for the first time, the WHO conducted the world, first world conference on air pollution. It never happened in history of humanity. So this means the magnitude of the problem, which is a planetary crisis. And Gandhi had the foresight to understand in 1918. I don't know who was polluting air in India in 1918. So you see, the way in which Dadabhai Naroji could understand the significance of idea of Swaraj to mitigate poverty, Gandhi in 1918, 12 years later, he was invoking the idea of Swaraj to remind that we need to have clean air, clean water, and of course access to food grains. Having said this, there are very fascinating dimensions. The recently, National Institute of Advanced Studies from Bangalore, they were bringing out a book, Gandhi for 21st Century. So somebody contacted me and said, can you contribute an article, 6,000 word article? So I said, I'll write an article, Gandhi and air pollution. And he was quite stunned. He said, did Gandhi write it? Was there air pollution during that time? I said, yes, that is how we understood. And he wrote that in modern civilization, air would be polluted, people would run away from cities to the far off places. So therefore, look at the idea of Swaraj, which was conceived in terms of clean air, clean water. And we are facing a crisis today. So this is one aspect which is quite extremely important, which I have elaborated in my article. The other one is that, Gandhi never defined Swaraj in terms of one religion. Never ever. See, today many people say one culture, one nation, one election, everything is one. Some kind of a uniformity. So when Gandhi was attending the second roundtable conference in 1931, he gave a speech in Federal Structure Committee. And he said, my definition of Swaraj doesn't mean the Hindu Raj. It would never mean the Raj of the Muslims or Christians. In my definition of Swaraj, people of all religions would coexist, whether Hindus are there in power or in position, or Christians or Muslims, they would treat them as citizens of the country, regardless of their faith, regardless of the creed that they follow. So today, this idea of Swaraj has been endangered to a great extent. Because today, the way society is polarized, the way in which religion is employed to mobilize people for electoral purposes, this goes against the very vein of Swaraj. The other point, I wanted to just flag 2 points. Gandhi never said that during pre-British period there was no Swaraj. Some people say that 1200 saal ki gulami, that we need to, understand that we lost our freedom 1200 years back, not after the British stayed. Here in RUSA, 23rd March 1921, while addressing a meeting in Kathajodi River, Gandhi said, that there was Swaraj in pre-British period. During Mughal rule, he said, Shivaji could emerge, Rana Pratap could emerge to take on Aurangzeb or Akbar, because there was some degree of Swaraj. But after the Britishers came, who challenged militarily the Britishers? After they considered nobody actually, because Britishers completely disarmed the whole of India, so that nobody could challenge. So today, that 1200 saal ki gulami, invoked by some of the leaders, that goes against the very idea of Swaraj outlined by Mahatma Gandhi. And he cautioned in 1947 that if this kind of communal interpretation of history would take place, that would affect education. Education itself would be communalized. And many phases of Indian history would be deleted by all those who subscribe to communalism. 1946, a year before India's independence. So today exactly we are confronting a situation. Islamic period is being deleted. Some people say there was a temple beneath Taj Mahal, or temple, around destruction of temple in Qutub Minar, whatever it is. So all kinds of such interpretations are being given. And there was a strange, kind of a message I received from a friend in Kannada, who settled down in India, very dear friend. Why all the time President of India presents Taj Mahal, a replica of Taj Mahal, is a gift because Taj Mahal represents Muslims? I said, a thing of beauty cannot be looked at from the perspective of religion. I said, I was working with President Narayana. He hardly gave a present to the dignitaries outside. He presented the idol of Ganesh to President of France, who kept it in his personal drawing room. He has given so many other presents. So look at Taj Mahal. Can anybody ever think that it is Islamic, and then Konark a Hindu, or for that matter Khajuraho a Hindu? The things of beauty are things of beauty, whosoever built it. Jawaharlal Nehru, in Discovery of India, referring to Taj Mahal, he wrote that in the soul of Iran implanted in the body of India. Okay, Tagore, can Tagore be looked at only from the perspective of the Bengali identity? Okay, the thing of beauty is the thing of beauty. So therefore, these kind of things which are confronting now, Gandhi cautioned, and he said that was actually violating the very tenets of idea of Swaraj. At the end, I would like to say that he had given different types for Swaraj. He said there is organic Swaraj. What is organic Swaraj? He said the problems internal to India, if you can solve ourselves without taking help from outside, that he said that is organic Swaraj, which is very fascinating. And then he said, we know Purna Swaraj was declaration was adopted by the Indian National Congress in 1929. And that Purna Swaraj is beautiful. If you look at that resolution, I'm not going into it. The other point I would like to say that, he said, a few months before his assassination, he said Swaraj would not automatically lead to Suraj. Suraj means good governance. So Swaraj has to be converted to Suraj. So therefore today if you do not have good governance, whether it's in Odisha or in Uttar Pradesh or in Kerala or wherever it is, this means Suraj is yet to be converted to good governance. So if Kerala, Tamil Nadu, they are hailed as states with higher human development indices because of quality of governance, this means they have successfully converted Swaraj to Suraj. So the challenge here is it's a continuous process. It's not a it's a long drawn out process. So therefore Gandhi cautioned that there will be many slippery slopes in our arduous journey to achieve Swaraj. And we are completely confronting that situation. There are several slippery slopes. So at the end, I would like to, quote a line from Utkal Mani Gopavant Das's Mandira Atmakatha. Mandira Atmakatha is a beautiful poem. It's centered around Swaraj. When he was in prison, and he was being taken to train in Delhi jail, he wrote a beautiful poem, Mandira Atmakatha, which is a masterpiece in Oriya literature. And he said, Hindu, Musalman, Buddha, Christian, Sikh, Jain, Jete Bharata Santan, Jete Dharma, Jete Varna, Jati Kula, Bharata Janani Samastan Kamula, Eko Asa, Eko Laksha, Eko Dhyana, Ekatra Anturi, Ekatra Smasana, Eko Karma Khela, Eko Matru Pade, Kara Eko Prana Sampade Vipade, Ekata Mantra Rakha Sadamati, Hebo Ehi Bhabe Swarajya Prabhat. So therefore, from Dadabhai Naroji to Gopavandhu Das, we remember him for those immortal lines, Nisupuro Deha, Desamati, Desamasi Chari Dante, Swarajya Pate, Jete Achine. See, the pan-Indian aspect of Swaraj, whether it was taken forward by a Parsi, later by Gandhi, later by USA. And now we are discussing this in Utkal University on the occasion of 75th anniversary of India's independence. So thank you so much for being so efficient.